Good morning, everyone. I'm Nick Slavic. I'm the proprietor of the Nick Slavic Painting and Restoration Company. I'm also the host of Ask a Painter Live, a weekly segment on Facebook Live where contractors, homeowners, anybody else sends me questions and I answer them live on Facebook. So, this week, you guys have been sending me your questions, and as I promised last week, if I use your question today, I will be sending you one of my handmade mugs with the logo on here, hand glazed and fired. So, I've been collecting up all your questions. I will go through those in a little bit. First, in your live feed, there is a follow button. If you'd like to automatically get updates every time I go live, hit that, follow me, and you'll get a notification. Also, there is a upcoming feature, hopefully this year, where two people can live stream in conjunction and sort of do a coordinated effort. As soon as that becomes available, I will be testing that out and finding a good use for that here too. So look for that in the upcoming future here. So, of the questions this week, Pat Scripture had sent a question in. Trim inside the house. Is there an easy way to fix a bad job of filling and painting holes made by the nails? Something that actually hides the holes. Okay, so normally when you're going to paint woodwork, you need to fill the nail holes, and then you also need to caulk along the cracks there as well. So a lot of people use vinyl mud, drywall mud, other things to fill the holes. Normally what you do is you mound it up with your finger, work it into the hole, leave a little bit on the outside, and then you come back a little bit later, sand it off, prime and paint again. You can also, people caulk the cracks, joints here and where it meets the wall. Don't ever use painter's caulk to fill the holes. It is non-sandable and you leave little smudges everywhere. And it goes without saying that doesn't matter what painting project you use, don't ever use silicone caulk or silicone adhesive to fill any of that stuff. You run into an oil and water situation with paint where if you paint over pure silicone, it'll just bead up and then you have to either dig it all out or prime it and start over. So siliconized painter's caulk is okay. It's got a little bit of silicone in it, but it is a paintable form that you can use. Now, most people will use either lightweight mud or a vinyl spackle to fill all the nail holes. That's fine. It works just fine, but as a professional, I always seek out the better ways to do it. What you want is something very hard, something that will not shrink, and something that is sandable. So you can use general drywall mud, but I bought a few things here to show you. Bondo makes a great glazing spot putty. This stuff is a dark red, and this sort of Bondo you do not need to mix with a second part. So this is nice to throw in your toolbox and you can fill the holes. The only downside is if you use a lot of this or you have a larger hole, this will actually shrink a little bit and you may need to do a second one. The benefits of using something like this, and this is just the particular one that I have access to. There's a whole bunch of other companies that make this sort of thing. This one, they say it's used for just about anything, but automotive is its main use. The benefit of using something like this is that it dries rock hard, and most times it'll be harder than the substrate that you'll be putting on there. The downside is it takes a long time to dry and it is very difficult to sand, and you really have to take your time and get it perfectly level with the surface there. So that's one thing you can use there. There's the old tried and true standard Bondo for automotive, and this one I keep the hardener taped to it so I don't lose it, but this you mix up a small amount. You apply it to the surface, dries fairly quickly because it is a two-part. It dries very hard, even harder than the spot putty here. Downside is you have to work in small batches, and again, very hard to sand. This stuff even more so than this. A lot of times when I do historic architectural restoration where somebody has a post cap or a rotted piece of wood that is too costly to replace, or they cannot find a replacement, or they can't find a carpenter to replace it using old wood, I will actually rebuild it using a combination of restoration epoxies and Bondo and stuff like this. But remember, you have to get this stuff almost perfect to the profile smoothed out because it is very difficult to sand. If you kind of mound it up and smear it all over and just hope to level it out with a sander, you will be there all day or have to dig it out and start over. So another option there. Let's see. In my interior gear, I do have some vinyl spackle. I have regular mud. If you don't want to, I would say for smaller areas or architectural restorations, nail holes, things like that, use this. If you're going to do an entire new house of nail holes, get a very, very hard, fast-drying mud. A standard lightweight spackle will not be good enough. You can just push your fingernail right into that stuff. Go for either an all-purpose mud. That's something you can find every hardware store, every home building center, every big box store. Or what you can do is actually buy like a 5-minute mud or a 10-minute mud in a powder, and you mix it up to the consistency that you need. The only downside is, 5-minute or 10-minute, you have a small working time to use it. But again, the benefit of that is that it dries very hard, or at least much harder than a standard drywall mud. So they also sell a whole bunch of painter's putties. There's a thing called glazing. It is not for this use. It's for actually glazing around window panes like that. A lot of that painter's putty actually does not dry hard, or takes so long to dry hard that it's not sandable, or it's not really feasible for that. And I brought my, this is an old container, but I have all my interior wood putties in here, different colors. These you use for filling the holes in stainable woodwork. Do not ever use these to fill holes on paintable woodwork. These are all oil-based products. They take years to dry, and with the oils, they will leak through any paint that you go over. And that's why when you have the golden oak woodwork or something dark like this in your house and you want to paint it, you use a nice oil primer, not only for adhesion to that surface, but also to stop the bleeding of products like this. So if you have painted woodwork in your house, this is technically hole filler, wood putty. Don't use this. This is just for stained and varnished woodwork. So, Pat, thank you for your question. I will be sending you a mug for that. Let's go down the list here, see what else. Oh, and I should mention that the standard practice for filling the nail holes in new stuff is pretty simple. You can find the nail holes, fill it, sand it, caulk all the cracks, prime everything over, sand the primer, and then start over with your enamel. It sounds like in Pat's house, she has a whole bunch of nail holes that were not done in the correct way. So what you would want to do is sand them all down. I would use a random orbital sander. In this particular one, you can hook up to a shop vac through the attachment in the back, and especially if you're inside a house, hook it up to a shop vac. It won't be a dust-free operation. It'll be nearly dust-free, and you don't want to be sanding down all the enamel in a house without a shop vac attached to it. After you get everything smooth, you're going to be taking away quite a bit of the enamel. Do the same thing again. Start over, filling the holes. If the caulk is loose or there's cracks in it, fix that as well. Sand all the nail holes again with the products that I mentioned. Prime over everything to give it a good substrate, and then start over with your enamel. So, very difficult process. There's only 2 jobs that are the most difficult, sort of technical-wise, painting projects homeowners or professionals can do in a house. Number 1 would be enameling kitchen cabinets, and number 2 is enameling or finishing woodwork in a house that currently has people living in it. Because of carpets, because of finished wall, because of all these other things. Very difficult process, takes a ton of time. New construction is much quicker. Obviously, there's no finished floors, and usually the walls have yet to be painted, so you can get a little on there. But yeah, just don't beat yourself up about it. It takes a ton of time. I just recently did 3 estimates this last week for enameling kitchen cabinets and an entire houses full of stained and varnished woodwork. And I kind of described to the people that, me and my apprentices, it usually takes us 40 hours of prep time just to get an area ready to go for priming, nail filling, enameling, things like that. And that's us with 2 trucks full of gear, many years of experience, and everybody knows what they're doing. So it's a very technically difficult project, and there's a lot that goes into it. So onward. And you guys certainly, I'm picking questions from this last week now, but if you have anything you want me to expound upon that I'm talking about now, or you have questions for me, again, I will certainly go through yours as well. Kathy Mead sent me a question. What is the best kind of paint to use on furniture that will not leave the surface tacky? A tacky surface on furniture is due to using wall paint or exterior paint or something that's acrylic, latex, something that's elastomeric and has a little give to it that doesn't dry hard. There are many, many sort of interchangeable, meaningless words in the painting industry: eggshell, satin, semi-gloss, gloss, and enamel. Words like that, they sort of signify, or at least give you an idea what's in the can, but there's not a standard. When something says satin, a satin from Sherwin-Williams will not be a satin from Benjamin Moore. And even within product lines, if you use a Benjamin Moore Advanced Satin versus a Benjamin Moore Aura Satin, two very different paints, two very different shines, so it's not a standard process. Same thing with enamels. There are enamels in the traditional sense, or at least the understanding of most professional painters, are paints that dry very hard, have a little glossier surface, and are made for trim, furniture, cabinets, other things like that, where you need a very hard, durable, washable, enduring surface. Enamels are very difficult to work with. They don't cover well. You normally have to be applied by a professional. A lot of them are oil-based or hybrid oil waters. Again, very difficult to work with. Whereas wall paints, the traditional latex or acrylic wall paints, are very flexible. They cover well, very owner and homeowner friendly, and you know what you would consider a standard wall paint is very easy to use compared to that. Now, people gravitate towards those when they're doing trim or cabinets or something. They usually just pick a higher shine level than what they would do for a wall, and it goes on fine, it covers, but it doesn't level out. It doesn't give you that beautiful sort of smooth eggshell, satiny sort of surface. And they're certainly not durable, as many of you know if you've ever tried to wash a wall. So to me, enamel is another one of those meaningless words in the painting industry, because I see a lot of flat wall paints being called flat enamels as well. And when you see that, it signifies that it might dry a little harder, it might be a little more washable, but a true enamel is more of, here's kind of my go-to, the Benjamin Moore Advance. This is actually a hybrid product. It's an oil molecule emulsified in a water molecule. So the water is the vehicle to get it onto the wall, and then when the water evaporates, the oil is left behind. This stuff does not cover well at all. If you were to try to paint a wall with it in the normal sense with a roller and a brush, very difficult coverage. It does almost no hiding over the previous stuff. But what you gain from something like that is it takes a long time to dry, but it dries rock hard. And you can take a Scotch-Brite pad to it, you can scrub it, you can wash it, you can use all sorts of chemicals on it. And it's a much more rigid, it's a much more durable product. You don't get the flexibility of like an elastomeric, a latex, or acrylic. So certainly if you were to use that on the outside of your house, it would probably craze or crack in a short period. So Kathy, when you have a flexible, tacky paint surface on a piece of furniture, it is because one of these non-enamels was used, one of these standard wall paints. And I see this a lot when I go through, I'm a huge fan of antique furniture, home decoration, things like that. And when I go to flea markets, when I go to antique stores that have painted furniture, first thing I do is I look to see, was there chalk paint used on it? Was there wall paint used on it? How did they do it? The most beautiful pieces of furniture you'll find are done with high quality enamels, done in a professional way. A lot of them end up being oils or hybrids. Most of the furniture I see in those places is done with wall paint, and you can understand why. I mean, you go buy a mist tint gallon for a couple bucks, you refinish an end table or a dresser, looks relatively good, but it's got no durability to it. And one way to check is if you press one of your fingers down as hard as you can and lift up, you'll feel the tackiness of something like that. Now, two ways to fix this. If it's a piece of furniture that is worthless or not worth very much or not made of real materials, maybe it's fiberboard or chipboard, start over. It's not worth trying to do anything to this unless you maybe want to put a top coat on, which I will talk about that later. If it's something, the professional way to do it, if somebody asked me to do it, I would want to get rid of all that, because that is now a weak layer between whatever the wood or substrate is and then whatever will come in contact with it. And you're always going to have that weak layer no matter how good of a finish you put on top. So the professional way to do it would be to get rid of all that finish and start over. Oil prime it, sand the oil primer, and actually use an enamel. And that's the painted version of it. The stained and varnish version of it, if somebody used a water-based varnish or a water-based lacquer over the top, you'll probably get the same thing. And the professional way to do it is get rid of it and start over. if you have a piece of furniture that actually has a good finish applied to it, it looks good, it's a decorative finish, you don't want to try to replicate it or start over and do it again, a little trick is actually using an oil-based polyurethane over that wall paint. And like I said, you will always have that sort of weak layer in there, but an oil-based polyurethane will add a nice wear layer to it, and it'll end up being the lesser of two evils. If it's a beautiful decorative finish that you've worked a long time on, but it just needs a protective coating, and I brought a sample of something here for you. This is Fabulon. I get this from Sherwin-Williams. This is my go-to polyurethane or wood floor finish. It's probably in the things that I find. Benjamin Moore has a similar product, a little more difficult to find. But Fabulon is about the hardest drying polyurethane that I can find. So you can apply the oil-based polyurethane right over a piece of furniture like that. I would do 2 coats, sanding in between. With polyurethane, you have to sand to promote adhesion. Yeah, and that's a little trick if you have a tacky piece of furniture where that'll actually create a nice wear layer. You may run into problems later with it, but if you want to preserve that finish, that's sort of the way to go. So, Kathy, I hope that helps you. And then we'll go on to last question here. Curtis Tankersley. What do you feel is the best primer for priming cabinets? I typically use shellac or oil-based primer to make sure I have great adhesion and maximum tannin block. However, I see more and more people using latex products like Insulex sticks and other multi-surface primers. I get the adhesion part, but can latex effectively block tannin bleed over time? No, I am not a believer in using any of those water-based products, even if they're the new water-based shellac and other things like that for priming woodwork or cabinets. It makes me very nervous. I experiment with them all the time, hoping to find that magic one. But the oil primer and these other water-based primers cost about the same, except the oil primers always work. Latex primers maybe work. And when you're doing a $30,000 kitchen worth of cabinets, and you just don't want to smell something for one day and go with a water-based primer, to me, that is not a good upside for the homeowner. Also, I have never been let down by oil primer, either outside or inside. People always talk about the proverbial knots in cedar or pine outside that bleed. When I use oil primer, I have never had a knot bleed through that stuff. And people use shellac outside, this and that. I'm still nervous with shellac outside. Any bit of shellac outside, it's not an exterior rated product, and even if you cover it up with a latex house paint or an acrylic house paint, I'm still nervous about that. So this is again comes down to the proverbial, is it better for the contractor or is it better for the homeowner if you're a contractor? And Curtis in this case I know is. By using a water-based primer inside, is it better for the homeowner or is it better for you? If you just don't want to clean out your spray equipment, or you don't want to smell something for a day or have to gear up with all the respirators and stuff, just to do that to me is not a worthwhile endeavor. I will always use the oil primer on that stuff. 30 years from now, we will probably not have oil primer, or we'll probably have a water-based version or a low VOC version of it, and that's fine. I will keep experimenting with it, but there are many things that you can save time on, save money on. To me, when you're enameling an entire set of kitchen cabinets, which in a lot of these houses now could be worth $30,000, to me, it's really not worth it. And for the little bit of extra, smell that the family has to live with for about a day, and for me gearing up with safety gear, and for me spending some extra time cleaning up spray equipment, no questions asked. It's such a non-answer for me that I will say this though, in my shop I have been experimenting with when I get new cabinets and they're cabinets that don't have a lot of tannin. If they're not oak, if they're not cedar, if they're not even alder, things like that. If it's a maple, if it's something like that, I've actually been experimenting with the advanced version to go with the enamel of that primer. And it still makes me a tiny bit nervous because it is always block stains for me. But, oh, sorry, I got a little pop up here. It's always block stains for me, but you can tell the stains migrate through to the primer, and when the primer dries, it seals the stains in the primer. When I use oil primer, the stains never migrate through the primer and you can't see them. So sometimes even when I stain an existing cabinet or something like that, I've done experiments with those. The primer will turn kind of that tobacco orangish color in certain areas where you can see the bleeding through. That makes me supremely nervous, even though I've never had it bleed through the actual top coat. So, promising. That's a hybrid though. That's an oil-water hybrid. It's not a water base. Now, it dries a little bit quicker. It goes on easier. Doesn't have the smells. So if I had to go with something other than my oil-based primer, it would be something next to this. This is probably the next most promising item as far as that goes. But yeah, the sort of tried and true, for interior and exterior actually is the cover stain. And if you need a little more leveling, a little more smoother finish, I'll even add Penetrol, which is an oil additive to give you longer open time with that stuff, to make it smooth out a little bit. So let's see if I think you had another question here, Curtis. Sealing the walls once wallpaper has been removed. Oil or shellac is my go-to depending on the surface. One of my reps is trying to sell me latex for this. I get tried to, every time I talk with my reps, they're all good guys, but you can tell that everything is moving towards water-based, and they always try to sell you on the water-based stuff. I am not on board yet. Everything is promising. I'm always willing to experiment with it, but when something works so good and you have so much time and money and reputation on the line, still for me, a lot of the oil-based primers are good. Now, there's two ways to go about the wallpaper stuff. Number one, you can wash it more, or number two, if there's still a little bit of glue haze left on after stripping wallpaper, you can prime it. I've used water-based primers for it. In this case, seems to do well because most glues are water-based. When I have to do that, I find that actually spending more time and getting the walls completely squeaky clean, glue-free, no haze, nothing, then you don't need to prime them at all. So in an average, let's say a bathroom, you strip off all the wallpaper. That's a lengthy enough process there. I would take the time and actually wash more then. I would get me and one of my apprentices in there and just scrub like crazy. And one of the tricks to the wallpaper remover is actually one of these sort of gas station squeegees. We use Scotch-Brite pads to get the haze off, and top to bottom on the wall, you actually take the squeegee and you drag all that glue stuff down and catch it on the bottom in the plastic, and that will actually get rid of quite a bit of that glue haze left on there. I would spend my time doing that versus priming, because if I can save my homeowners, if you think about an average bathroom repaint, it's basically just 2 top coats. If they have to spend the money to strip the wallpaper, then prime, then 2 top coats, you're basically doing 4 processes of that bathroom. While I'm stripping, I would just keep the walls wet, and I'll use a squeegee, I'll get all that stuff off, and if the walls are completely glue-free, you go 2 top coats right over the top of it. So I spend probably 10% more time cleaning the walls versus another 30 or 40% more time putting another 3rd coat of paint on that wall. So I hope that helps. Now, if it's just a disaster underneath, if there's a whole bunch of bare drywall, if nobody prepped it underneath, the walls are all damaged, you did a whole bunch of skim coating, then in that case, I prime just to give it a nice substrate to start over with. But a couple years ago, I started experimenting with Valspar's line of products, the Optimus and the Aspire. And for those of you who have watched more than one of these, you understand that I am morally and vehemently opposed to primer and paint in one. It is not a good primer. It's not a good paint. You're basically getting the worst of 2 evils in both of those things. As a professional, I would rather go with a true primer, and a true paint, and a true enamel, something like that, in a 2-coat process, then try to find one product to solve it all, because you'll find that you don't get any benefits from the individual characteristics of each of those things. As a professional, I look for race car products, and by that I mean something that is very specifically built for one thing, and it does that one thing exceedingly well, like a Formula One car. A Formula One car cannot go down a gravel road. That's made for something else. So I find things that do very specific things very well, use those exactly how the technical data sheets ask me to, and then I find the next product to do the next very specific thing that it's meant to do. And in that case, you get very high performance in those certain things, but you just have to follow the certain rules that come along with those products. But like I was saying, this is not a paint and primer in one. This is just a super thick, very durable wall paint. And I used to, after all my patching in people's houses, I used to have to sand the patches, prime all the patches because they would accept paint differently, and then 2 coats over the top of that. I've been doing a lot of experiments with this paint over the years where 2 coats right over that, there's no blocking, there's no dead spots in the wall. It actually covers very well, and it seals walls very well. I've done experiments with this where I've skim coated entire bathrooms in bare drywall mud and just put 2 coats of this over the top of it, and it looks as good as when I prime and put 2 coats on there. So, and it adheres very well to that bare drywall mud. So, Curtis, especially in those bathrooms or those rooms where you strip the wallpaper, I find that even a paint like that, I don't know how to categorize it. It sticks much better than a normal wall paint. It doesn't get that rubbery sort of feeling. It probably approaches more of an enamel, but it's very friendly to work with. But it hides extremely well, relatively inexpensive. I think, even at my contractor price, I can get it for less than 30 bucks a gallon. Yeah, it blocks out a lot of those patches very well. So a combination of extra washing and then using a very high quality paint like that is good. Now, the reason that I use a product like that for my interior stuff is I use hundreds and hundreds of gallons of that a winter. I love using stuff, Sherwin-Williams Duration, Benjamin Moore Aura is one of my favorites, but they're 75 bucks a gallon. And if I can save my homeowners a little bit, if you do an entire new house for walls, I mean, you could be approaching 30 or 40 gallons of paint, and at 75 bucks a gallon, it's not a small undergoing. So if I can get the same quality finish that performs the same, hides the same, looks the same, feels the same, smells the same for half the price, that's normally what I do. And I actually did a 3-room test in my own house with the highest end offering from one company, and then when Valspar came out with these 2 new products, I used those 2 there, and they smell the same, they feel the same going on, they look the same when they're dry, they covered their colors very well, and they all blocked out those patches instead of me going and priming. So I find stuff like that. It's kind of a hidden gem in the paint industry, and I get my stuff from Ace Hardware there. They're lucky enough to stock quite a supply of that. So, all right, check and see if there was any last. Okay, I think that is it. So, Kathy, Pat, and Curtis, you guys, you'll be getting mugs from me. We have some different colors here, and I leave the glazes up to my mug person. The blue is my favorite in particular, but thank you guys for submitting all the questions this last week. I was an overwhelming, sorry about that incoming call. I was going to just have one question this week, but there was such an overwhelming amount of questions that came in, I decided to do 3. Thank you guys so much. Remember, there is a follow button on the live feed. You will get notifications from me. If you like this stuff, share it with somebody else. If you think somebody else will get some value from this, share it along with them. And thanks again, everybody. Podcast with Tom Reber, Strongpreneur Podcast. If you want to hear more about my philosophy about business, I have a podcast with Chris Shank, PDCA website, Contractor College. There is the Paint Dealer Magazine, Paint Contractor Magazine, that did a large feature on me there. Check that out. And thank you guys for tuning in again, and we will see you next week.